Franklin in the building. Hey, everybody. Hey, Miss Roberts, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good, good. So for our audience, I want to introduce, we have Sister Tiffany Roberts, who's going to be joining us. We wanted to talk a little bit today about Atlanta and Atlanta criminal justice. In particular, Tiffany wrote an article, and I'm going to give you a brief bio, Tiffany, in a second, called "The Collapse of the Criminal Legal Reform in the Black Mecca," and it just recently ran in Essence. And the article hit me because, you know, recently the organization I'm associated with, we've been doing a lot of work on anti-policing, on working around bad policing, I should say, in terms of stopping Cop City. And Tiffany Roberts is somebody who's been doing that work in various forms for a long time in Atlanta. And just currently, let me give you a quick bio. So Tiffany Roberts is an attorney with the Southern Center for Human Rights. She has been a civil rights attorney, a criminal defense attorney in Atlanta, and practicing since 2008 as a defense attorney. She's represented hundreds of indigent clients facing felony prosecution and graduated from the Gideon Promise Child Advocacy Training Program. She's worked particularly on closing down the Atlanta jail, and so that's partly what we want to talk about when we come back. So I want to thank Tiffany for coming on. I really appreciate you doing this for us. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. It's morning. It's like Monday part 2, so I'm okay, but a little sleepy.
Cool. So let's start with the Atlanta public jail closing, because that was something you were heavily involved, and I think that really adds to the article that you wrote, in essence, around the missed opportunity for criminal justice reform. So can you talk a little bit about what that work was to close? Because there were some promises made about closing down the jail, but why was there a focus on closing that particular jail? And how did that lead to your participation in working with particularly Keisha Lance Bottoms, who's currently the mayor of Atlanta?
Sure. So Marilyn Wynn, who is our friend, she is the founder of Women on the Rise, which is an organization led entirely by formerly incarcerated women of color, mostly Black women. And Ms. Wynn had spent quite a bit of time in the Atlanta City Detention Center and in other carceral facilities before she became an organizer. And so she launched a campaign to close down the jail toward the end of Mayor Reed's term, and he immediately preceded Mayor Bottoms. And so at the time that Mayor Bottoms took office, her first piece of legislation was bail reform. Ms. Wynn was in those rooms as well. It really was a community effort to bring bail reform to the table in Atlanta. And I was on a progressive agenda working group led by myself and another attorney, Miguel Dominguez. And we had a whole set of recommendations to the city. And one of those recommendations supported Women on the Rise's push to close the Atlanta City Detention Center. The reason it was important is because the language that Women on the Rise and the Communities Over Cages Coalition uses is that it's an extra jail. And that's not to suggest that we need all of these cages, but the jail was built for the Olympics. And after the Olympics, the city of Atlanta routinely rented out space or beds to other facilities. For example, when I was a public defender, some of my clients were held in the Atlanta City Detention Center because Fulton has always been an overcrowded jail. And so we supported Women on the Rise's call. And then thereafter, Andre Dickens, who notably now does not seem to support the immediate closure of the Atlanta City Detention Center. He authored legislation to set up a task force to reimagine the Atlanta City Detention Center. And I served, Ms. Wynn was one of the directors of that process. And I was one of the members of that task force. It's just a tremendous waste of money.
Mhm.
It's a part of the city's legacy of hiding our poor, of hiding people who are unsheltered. And the money could just be used for so much healing as opposed to it being used to unnecessarily punish people who are accused of things like jaywalking.
Now, that's interesting because I don't know a lot of folks knew that part of that history of that jail, unless obviously you're involved in the sort of day to day work around closing it. That the jail was built during the time of Olympics as sort of an overflow holding area. So that's really interesting to point out. So it seemed that at one point there was a promise from Mayor Bottoms to close the jail. Can you talk a little bit about where you guys felt, again, for those who are working sort of intimately on the process, where all of a sudden it started to be a retreat from, let's say, the promise to close the jail, and what happened again when you guys started noticing that there seemed to be this retreat? How responsive was Mayor Bottoms in trying to have conversations about why she no longer wanted the jail closed or was no longer recommending it to be closed?
So I want to first say that Mayor Bottoms has not said that she no longer recommends that the jail be closed. But what we've seen is processes just become stale, to become stagnant. And so the final meeting, in-person meeting for the task force, we met for a year. And there was a policy working group. There was a working group around like the architecture of whatever this Center for Wellness and Healing would be. And then there was a programs working group who was responsible for figuring out what kinds of services people needed in the new facility, because it was to raise and replace or to repurpose the original facility for a center to become a center for equity and wellness. And so that last meeting was February 2020. And there was supposed to be another one after that, but remember, like right after that is when we started to see the effects of COVID. And so the final reports had been drafted, the language for each working group had been approved, but instead of us having a final meeting, the reports were just released. We weren't able to really convene within that short period of time. And then by March and April, the March and April of 2020, during the pandemic, we started to see so we started, and we being like the broader criminal legal reform landscape in Atlanta, started to push around releases, because we knew, like, even though we didn't know a lot about COVID, we knew that jails were going to be a hotspot because people can't wash their hands, people can't socially distance, people didn't have PPE, and we started to focus on that and protocols for arrest, like to arrest fewer people so that they wouldn't be sent to these jails. I would say around that period of time, when conservatives started to be concerned that people were, conservatives are always concerned about who's getting out of jail, right? They always want to make sure that they are caging as many people as possible and that there's space to cage more. And began the additional push from Buckhead for people not to be released because of COVID. I think that sort of like stirred the pot, and we stopped seeing public comments from City Hall about jail closure. So Mayor Bottoms was quoted as once saying, "We will no longer be in the jailing business." She never came back to us and said that she didn't support jail closure, and she pushed back against people like Patrick Labatt, the sheriff, who wants Fulton to buy ACDC, but those were not public declarations. And
Mhm.
we talked about this as social justice folks, that the failure to do so publicly allowed everyone else to just crowd the space, right? Take up all of the air. And then when we started to see the nationwide rise in gun violence, right? So noting that crime is what we call crime, right? Criminalized acts are down generally. Gun violence is up. And what public health professionals are saying is that has more to do with the pandemic than anything. But allowing people to take up all of the air talking about a crime wave when it really is a gun violence pandemic made it so easy for those who never supported jail closure, like Michael Julian Bond, like Patrick Labatt, right? So he ran for sheriff after realizing his jail, that he was the former Department of Corrections chief in Atlanta, realizing that his jail was going to be shut down. So he hopped to another facility, ran for office in Fulton. Those people who never supported jail closure got to exploit the campaign and hold up at rising crime as the reason that the jail shouldn't be closed. And now everyone has, not everyone, but many people have bought that hook, line, and
Mhm.
sinker.
Now you said that Mayor Bottoms has never come out and said that she's not for the closing, but we're obviously entering the last stages of her mayoral life, and she's obviously not running for reelection. And so I have two quick questions. One is, based on what you said, and do you think there is still hope that there will be closing before her term is actually up? Because if Kasim Reed gets in there, I have serious doubt that he's going to close the jail. In fact, if anything, I think he's maybe has made public statements to the opposite. And then secondly, I wanted you to go back a little bit around, we mentioned the pandemic. What impacted the killing of Rashard Brooks and sort of the national movement around the issue of police brutality have locally on your campaign? Did that do anything to push the campaign forward at the time? Did it feel like that was adding some urgency to it? Before this latest, again, this new narrative that's recently gotten painted as like this rise in crime is now taking over the idea of like the police is now our friends again, particularly in mainstream rhetoric, right? So, two things. So, one, do you think there's still a chance for it to be closed? And then, what's the impact of some of the rallies and demonstrations and the movement that happened last year on the campaign that you guys were working on?
So the first question is, do I think there's still hope? I think that there's still hope because we can't forget that city council is necessary, right? So the mayor has the power to negotiate contracts, but city council has the power to authorize that negotiation. So the first thing that needs to happen is that city council needs to pass some legislation setting a closure date for ACDC. In the same way that council member Dickens, now candidate Dickens, authored the legislation for the task force, city council has the power to authorize legislation right now that sets a closure date and sets out the purpose of that facility or that land moving forward. Because at the end of the day, whether or not Mayor Bottoms will be vocal about the closure, that is of less consequence than whether these city council people will get on a good foot. And the one thing that has happened is the mayor has refused to negotiate with Fulton around jail beds, except for to say that Fulton could have, I think, 150 beds for a diversion or transitional facility, or a transition space for people in a diversion program. Well, Fulton has said, it's like, oh, we don't have 150 people they want 500 beds, but they're saying out of the over 1,500 people, probably now almost 2,000, if not more, people at the jail, that there are not 150 people who could qualify for a program that would allow them to be released early. And so the one thing I can say is the refusal to negotiate that contract. You're right that whoever is elected next is likely to jump headfirst into negotiating that contract with Fulton if city council doesn't act urgently, because all of the top candidates, with the exception of Antonio Brown, have said that they will not immediately close the Atlanta City Detention Center. So, and that is the power of the public safety narrative being hijacked by people who most of the time don't even live in this city, who never cared about what happened in Southwest Atlanta or West Atlanta or on the South Side, right? Those are the people who are controlling the rhetoric. And so city council really needs to, instead of worrying about how to be elected to a higher office, one, for them to look at the data, which says most people in Atlanta do actually support repurposing that facility, that we did our own survey. Zuri Murphy launched a survey, and it was before Cop City, and most Atlantans did not support Cop City. Communities Over Cages launched a survey, and most people do support using that money in that space for healing and to afford people the resources that are needed to thrive in the city with the highest wealth inequality gap, right? We are one of the most segregated cities, in which it is also the most difficult to move from poverty to middle class, right? That's Atlanta. And so that's one piece. And then the second question was around the killing of Rayshard Brooks. The killing of Rayshard Brooks actually happened after, like, I think the first meeting we had of the Use of Force Advisory Council, which was, all over the country during 2020, the summer of 2020. Cities were urged to have these use of force short-term councils that would research what was actually happening in Atlanta, in their cities, around police brutality. So shortly after that council met, I think maybe that week, Rayshard Brooks was killed, like 3 miles from City
Hmm.
Hall. And the impact of it, I would say, on organizers was just like a very tragic confirmation that everything we've been saying to people about this city was true. What happened with the mobilizations is because Atlanta sort of exists behind this facade of equity and progressive politics. What our elected officials did was they chose to have photo ops at certain marches. And so, you know, in a way, but they weren't really mobilized. They were just being highly visible during a time that it was politically advantageous for them to be visible.
Hmm.
But when it came down to voting for Rayshard Brooks' bill, which was not to defund APD, it was to hold money until they made certain changes. They refused to vote for it after almost an entire day, effectively an entire day of public comment supporting this. There are some people who say that that's because Mayor Bottoms called council and told them they better not pass it. I don't know that that happened, but if it did, it sort of speaks to, you know, what you see is not what you actually get in Atlanta, where we can go to other cities and if we have a figurehead that's easy to target, people are willing to organize. But in Atlanta, there is this unfortunate reality that people don't publicly criticize our Black elected officials, often because they're concerned about their own upward mobility. They want to know that they're going to be invited to certain spaces, certain galas, certain fundraisers, and also they want to be a part of the Black elite class, and that keeps them from being properly critical of the people that we elect to office.
So I want to, in your last paragraph in the article you wrote in Essence, um, um, again titled "The Collapse of the Criminal Legal Reform in the Black Mecca," it says the perilous web woven by Atlanta's Black misleadership class, white wealth, and law enforcement leaves justice-seeking communities weary. Yet we are determined to harness the power we have built until the day our leaders' courage matches ours. And then, based on what you just said, about the role of the Black leadership class, and how they get a pass sometimes, not only because there's folks who want to be next to them in the middle class, but there's also, again, we've talked about this before, this sort of representation thing where we can't criticize the Black folks because they look like us. And then I know you talked about hope, but why do you have hope in terms of what our next steps can be, considering what you think about the Black leadership class to begin with?
I think it's because the hope that I have is primarily because the power that we built, that we know we've been building for decades, and that maybe the world saw during the last election cycle, it didn't go anywhere. And so the questions that we have are questions that organizers need to ask themselves with respect to strategy. And it's not a matter of if certain things will happen, it's a matter of when. And we know that there are people, so there are bad actors like Michael Julian Bond, who will do everything that they can to subvert, to obstruct, to discourage, and will do anything to make that happen. But we know that. And since we know that, it's our responsibility to organize around that and to be honest about what's actually happening. You know, I think there are people who probably come into organizing in this city or just come into the city and they have this ideal of who we are, but it doesn't take long to be pulled over or to be mistreated. And the Black, when I say the Black misleadership class, I'm also talking about people who think that proximity to entertainers is what entitles them to be our leaders. And I think as long as we remember that we elect people into office, that does not that does not make them our de facto leaders, like our ideological leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They are the targets that we're looking at when we're organizing, when we're making demands. And so that's just what we have to continue to do. And I think you can always show them better than you can tell them. And so just there were people who never thought that the conversation around jail closure or bail reform could happen, that the conversation could not even happen. But now more people understand that the persistence and the brilliance of Black organizing is the thing that we have to depend on, not Black wealth, not your concerts, not who's, doing your PSAs. Those things are just like, those are like peripheral tactics. But the core of who we have to be are folks who realize that this work requires actual sacrifice. It requires discipline. It requires political education. And it requires that we actually love one another, the whole of all of ourselves, from regardless of what we bring to the table. We have to be willing to love one another and struggle with one another because we know what's at stake. And I think that eventually more in the city will find their way. But until they do, it's our responsibility to hold the work.
Thank you so much. I want to say Tiffany Roberts is one of the best organizers I've ever met in my life. One of the most dedicated organizers, a fantastic attorney, better attorney than I ever was and or wish to be. And she has been on the front lines of working in Atlanta for over a decade. So you're listening to the voice of somebody who really knows Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, who organizes day to day, who's in her community, who knows her community. So I want to thank you so much for making the time to come talk to us. And I hope to have you on again really soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Peace.
Peace.
We're going to come back and end out our Remix Morning Show.